15 of Anne of Green Gables. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, June 2011. Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 15. A Tempest in the School Teapot. "What a splendid day," said Anne, drawing a long breath. "Isn't it good just to be alive on a day like this? I pity the people who aren't born yet for missing it. They may have good days, of course, but they can never have this one. And it's splendider still to have such a lovely way to go to school by, isn't it?" "It's a lot nicer than going round by the road. That is so dusty and hot," said Diana practically, peeping into her dinner basket and mentally calculating, if the 3 juicy, toothsome raspberry tarts reposing there were divided among 10 girls, how many bites each girl would have. The little girls of Avonlea school all pooled their lunches, and to eat 3 raspberry tarts all alone, or even to share them only with one's best chum, would have forever and ever branded as awful mean the girl who did it. And yet, when the tarts were divided among 10 girls, you just got enough to tantalize you. The way Anne and Diana went to school was a pretty one. Anne thought those walks to and from school with Diana couldn't be improved upon even by imagination. Going round by the main road would have been so unromantic, but to go by Lover's Lane and Willowmere and Violet Vale and the Birch Path was romantic if ever anything was. Lover's Lane opened out below the orchard at Green Gables and stretched far up into the woods to the end of the Cuthbert farm. It was the way by which the cows were taken to the back pasture and the wood hauled home in winter. Anne had named it Lover's Lane before she had been a month at Green Gables. "Not that lovers ever really walk there," she explained to Marilla, "but Diana and I are reading a perfectly magnificent book, and there's a Lover's Lane in it, so we want to have one too. And it's a very pretty name, don't you think? So romantic. We can imagine the lovers into it, you know. I like that lane because you can think out loud there without people calling you crazy." Anne, starting out alone in the morning, went down Lover's Lane as far as the brook. Here Diana met her, and the 2 little girls went on up the lane under the leafy arch of maples. "Maples are such sociable trees," said Anne. "They're always rustling and whispering to you."
In case you've forgotten, one thing we talked about several chapters ago was the idea of personification, where something that is not human is described as if it is human. So just now, Anne has used personification in describing the maple trees. She says they are always rustling and whispering to you. They cannot truly whisper to you because they are trees, so this is personification.
Until they came to a rustic bridge. Then they left the lane and walked through Mr. Barry's back field and past Willowmere. Beyond Willowmere came Violet Vale, a little green dimple in the shadow of Mr. Andrew Bell's big woods. Of course, there are no violets there now, Anne told Marilla, but Diana says there are millions of them in spring. Oh, Marilla, can't you just imagine you see them? It actually takes away my breath. I named it Violet Vale. Diana says she never saw the beat of me for hitting on fancy names for places. It's nice to be clever at something, isn't it? But Diana named the Birch Path. She wanted to, so I let her, but I'm sure I could have found something more poetical than plain Birch Path. Anybody can think of a name like that. But the Birch Path is one of the prettiest places in the world, Marilla. It was. Other people besides Anne thought so when they stumbled on it. It was a little, narrow, twisting path, winding down over a long hill straight through Mr. Bell's woods, where the light came down sifted through so many emerald screens that it was as flawless as the heart of a diamond. It was fringed in all its length with slim young birches, white-stemmed and lissom-boughed. Ferns, starflowers, and wild lilies of the valley and scarlet tufts of pigeon-berries grew thickly along it. And there was always a delightful spiciness in the air, and music of bird-calls and the murmur and laugh of wood-winds in the trees overhead. Now and then you might see a rabbit skipping across the road if you were quiet, which, with Anne and Diana, happened about once in a blue moon. Down in the valley the path came out to the road, and then it was just up the spruce hill to the school. The Avonlea school was a whitewashed building, low in the eaves and wide in the windows, furnished inside with comfortable, substantial, old-fashioned desks that opened and shut, and were carved all over their lids with the initials and hieroglyphic 3 generations of school children. The schoolhouse was set back from the road, and behind it was a dusky fir wood, and a brook where all the children put their bottles of milk in the morning to keep cool and sweet until dinner hour. Marilla had seen Anne start off to school on the first day of September with many secret misgivings. Anne was such an odd girl. How would she get on with the other children? And how on earth would she ever manage to hold her tongue during school hours? Things went better than Marilla feared, however. Anne came home that evening in spirits. "I think I'm going to like school here," she announced. "I don't think much of the master, though. He's all the time curling his mustache, making eyes at Prissy Andrews."
Okay, historical note. So you've got to think about a little bit of math here, all right? In these days, at these times, in little country one-room schools like Anne is attending, to be a teacher was very different than it is nowadays. So, as soon as you were old enough and could pass an exam to get into it was called an academy. It was a combination of high school and college. As soon as you were able to pass the exam, you could go to that school. So you could arguably pass the exam into the academy when you were 15 or 16 years old. Let's say 16 just for the sake of argument, 16 years. You would then study for 1 or 2 years. So let's say that's 16 years old plus 2 more years. So you could arguably be 18 years old and be a teacher. So Anne's teacher could be as young as 18 or 19. Now the interesting thing is the students of this teacher at 18 or 19 years old, those students might be trying to pass this exam. They take the exam the first time and they don't pass it. So they study another year. Now they're 17 years old. They try to take the exam. They don't pass it. They study another year. They would then be 18 years old. This 18-year-old teacher could have students who are the same age and possibly even older than the teacher. So this is very different from nowadays. Nowadays, in order to go to college, you have to be done with high school, which most people, that takes them to about 18 years old. College to become a teacher nowadays takes 4 years. So nowadays, the youngest you're going to have a teacher is 18 plus 4, which would be about 22 years old. So that is a larger age difference than it was back then. So this is very important to understand when we find out that Anne says the teacher is making eyes at Prissy Andrews. The teacher here could be as young as 18 years old. And in the next sentence, Anne is going to tell us Prissy Andrews is 16 years old. And Anne thinks the teacher has a crush on Prissy. There's a bit of foreshadowing going on here as well. But don't get all, yucky, creeped out. This is a historical part of the story.
Prissy's grown up, you know. She's 16 and she's studying for the entrance examination into Queen's Academy at Charlottetown next year. Tilly Boulter says the master is dead gone on her. She's got a beautiful complexion and curly brown hair, and she does it up so elegantly. She sits in the long seat at the back, and he sits there too, most of the time, to explain her lessons, he says. Ruby Gillis says she saw him writing something on her slate, and when Prissy read it, she blushed as red as a beet, and giggled. And Ruby Gillis says she doesn't believe it had anything to do with the lesson. "Anne Shirley, don't let me hear you talk about your teaching that way again," said Marilla sharply. "You don't go to school to criticize the master. I guess he can teach you something, and it's your business to learn. and I want you to understand right off you are not to come home telling tales about him. That is something I won't encourage. I hope you were a good girl." "Indeed I was," said Anne comfortably. "It wasn't so hard as you might imagine, either. I sit with Diana. Our seat is right by the window, and we look down to the lake of shining waters. There were a lot of nice girls in school, and we had scrumptious fun playing at dinner time. It's so nice to have a lot of little girls to play with, but of course I like Diana best and always will. I adore Diana. I'm dreadfully far behind the others. They're all in the 5th book, and I'm only in the 4th. I feel that it's kind of a disgrace. But there's not one of them has such an imagination as I have, and I soon found that out. We had reading and geography and Canadian history and dictation today. Mr. Phillips said my spelling was disgraceful, and he held up my slate so that everybody could see it all marked over. I felt so mortified, Marilla. He might have been politer to a stranger, I think. Ruby Gillis gave me an apple, and Sophia Sloane lent me a lovely pink card with "May I see you" on it. I'm to give it back to her tomorrow. And Tilly Boulter let me wear her bead ring all the afternoon. Can I have some of those pearl beads off the old pincushion in the garret to make myself a ring? And oh, Marilla, Jane Andrews told me that Minnie McPherson told her that she heard Prissy Andrews tell Sarah Gillis that I had a very pretty nose. Marilla, that is the first compliment I ever had in my life, and you can't imagine what a strange feeling it gave me. Marilla, have I really a pretty nose? I know you'll tell me the truth." "Your nose is well enough," said Marilla shortly. Secretly she thought Anne's nose was a remarkably pretty one, but she had no intention of telling her so. That was 3 weeks ago, and all had gone smoothly so far. And now, this crisp September morning, Anne and Diana were tripping blithely down the birch path, two of the happiest little girls in Avonlea. "I guess Gilbert Blythe will be in school today," said Diana. "He's been visiting his cousins over in New Brunswick all summer, and he only came home Saturday night. He's awfully handsome, Anne, and he teases the girls something terrible. He just torments our lives out." Diana's voice indicated that she rather liked having her life tormented out than not. "Gilbert Blythe?" said Anne. "Isn't it his name that's written up on the porch wall with Julia bells and a big 'Take Notice' over them?"
So, we don't write take notices now, but sometimes children who have crushes on one another will put initials so-and-so plus so-and-so. If you are riding on the bus and the windows get fogged up, that's one place that those little announcements get written up with the fingers on the fog on the windows. Back in these times, children very often carried pocket knives to school, the boys did, and so they would carve things in the desks, they would carve things on the wooden porches, and so these take notices are probably carved into the wood on the porch. And so Anne's saying, "Isn't that Gilbert Blythe, the one who it says likes Julia Bell?"
"Yes," said Diana, tossing her head, "but I'm sure he doesn't like Julia Bell so very much. I've heard him say he studied the multiplication table by her freckles." "Oh, don't speak about freckles to me," implored Anne. "It isn't delicate when I've got so many. But I do think that writing take notices up on the wall about the boys and girls is the silliest ever. I should just like to see anybody dare to write my name up with a boy's. Not, of course," she hastened to add, "that anybody would." Anne sighed. She didn't want her name written up, but it was a little humiliating to know that there was no danger of it. "Nonsense," said Diana, whose black eyes and glossy tresses had played such havoc with the hearts of Avonlea schoolboys that her name figured on the porch walls in half a dozen take notices. "It's only meant as a joke. Don't you be too sure your name won't ever be written up. Charlie Sloane is dead gone on you. He told his mother, mind you, that you were the smartest girl in school. That's better than being good looking." "No, it isn't," said Anne, feminine to the core. "I'd rather be pretty than clever. And I hate Charlie Sloane. I can't bear a boy with goggle eyes. If anyone wrote my name up with his, I'd never get over it, Diana Barry. But it is nice to keep head of your class." "You'll have Gilbert in your class after this," said Diana, "and he's used to being head of his class, I can tell you. He's only in the 4th book, although he's nearly 14. 4 years ago his father was sick and had to go out to Alberta for his health, and Gilbert went with him. They were there 3 years, and Gil didn't go to school hardly any until they came back."
So again, a bit of a historical fact. The way children passed from one grade to another grade at this time period in the one-room schools, You learned everything that there was in one book. So Gilbert has only been to school enough to be in the 4th book. So they didn't really have grades. You just, when you had a chance to go to school, you would continue studying the book that you were in at that time. So Anne and Gilbert are older than most of the other children in their class. And Diana's explaining why Gilbert is behind. We already know Anne didn't have a chance to go to school when she was being watched by those other ladies because she had to work taking care of their children. So that's why Anne is behind. Here is why Gilbert's behind.
You won't find it so easy to keep head after this, Anne. I'm glad, said Anne quickly. I couldn't really feel proud of keeping head of little boys and girls of just 9 or 10. I got up yesterday spelling ebullition. Josie Pye was head, and mind you, she peeped in her book. Mr. Phillips didn't see her. He was looking at Prissy Andrews, but I did. I just swept her a look of freezing scorn, and she got as red as a beet and spelled it wrong after all. Those Pye girls are cheats all round, said Diana indignantly as they climbed the fence of Main Road. Gertie Pye actually went and put her milk bottle in my place in the brook yesterday. Did you ever?
So, this doesn't sound much like a tempest, does it? Remember, a tempest is a large, destructive storm like a hurricane. This doesn't sound very tempestuous, right? I mean, these Pye girls don't sound very pleasant, but it's not much of a tempest.
I don't speak to her now. When Mr. Phillips was in the back of the room, hearing Prissy Andrews' Latin, Diana whispered to Anne, "That's Gilbert Blythe sitting right across the aisle from you, Anne. Just look at him and see if you don't think he's handsome."
So from here on out, I'm selfish. I'm going to read this to you until we stop for today. Remember, you are looking for a tempest, a really nasty storm to be happening in this school Teapot. And you will need to explain why this is a good title for this chapter. Tomorrow, we will talk about how an image, how a picture of a one-room school can also help you understand the action in this half of the chapter and the action in the half of the chapter tomorrow. So I'm not going to have you think about what the school would look like today. It will definitely help you understand why this action makes sense when you see the picture of how a real school is set up. But today, you need to focus on where the tempest is. So Diana has just told Anne to look at Gilbert and see if Anne's Gilbert is handsome. Anne looked accordingly. She had a good chance to do so, for the said Gilbert Blythe was absorbed in stealthily, that means sneakily, pinning the long yellow braid of Ruby Gillis, who sat in front of him, to the back of her seat. Remember, the seats are made out of wood, so you would be able to pin something into the wood. He, Gilbert, was a tall boy with curly brown hair, rougish hazel eyes. So rougish means, you can tell he likes to have fun, but his fun doesn't always necessarily follow the rules. He had rougish hazel eyes and a mouth twisted into a teasing smile. Now, this is not the mean teasing. This is not the bullying teasing. You know how friends tease one another. That kind of teasing smile that the author means Gilbert has. Presently, Ruby Gillis, the girl with the long yellow braid, started up to take a sum to the master. She fell back into her seat with a little shriek, believing that her hair was pulled out by the roots. Everybody looked at her, and Mr. Phillips glared so sternly that Ruby began to cry. Gilbert had whisked the pin out of sight and was studying his history with the soberest face in the world. But when the commotion subsided, he looked at Anne and winked with inexpressible drollery. He knows Anne saw everything that went on. He's like, gee, wasn't that good? Yeah, look at the commotion that we created. I think your Gilbert Blythe is handsome, confided Anne to Diana, but I think he is very bold. It is not good manners to wink at a strange girl. But it was not until the afternoon that things really began to happen. Mr. Phillips was back in the corner explaining a problem in algebra to Prissy Andrews, and the rest of the scholars were doing pretty much as they pleased. So here's what they were doing. While the teacher is working with one student, the rest of them are eating green apples, whispering, drawing pictures on their slates, and driving crickets harnessed to strings up and down the aisle. Now, what would a slate be? A slate is like a miniature chalkboard. So you would have your own little pencil that you would use to write on that miniature chalkboard. Slate is a type of stone that can be cut in very narrow strips, and slates would be about the size of your social studies book. That's a good way of thinking about it. Now, it wouldn't be that thick as the social studies book, and it wouldn't be quite as heavy as the social studies book. But remember, I said slate is a type of stone, so it was pretty dense. So the scholars are drawing on their slates. You wouldn't have a notebook at this time period. You would have a slate. Some of them, while the teacher is back in the corner, were driving crickets harnessed to strings up and down the aisle. Gilbert Blythe was trying to make Anne Shirley look at him and failing utterly. So he wants Anne to look at him, but Anne's not looking at him. Why? Because Anne was at that moment totally oblivious. She doesn't know what's going on. Not only of the very existence of Gilbert Blythe, but of every other scholar in Avonlea School and of Avonlea School itself. Why? With her chin propped on her hands and her eyes fixed on the blue glimpse of the lake of shining waters that the west window afforded, she was far away in a gorgeous dreamland, hearing and seeing nothing save her own wonderful visions. She's imagining. Gilbert Blythe wasn't used to putting himself out to make a girl look at him and meeting with failure. Gilbert Blythe, remember, he's a cute boy. He's not used to trying to make a girl look at him and having the girl ignore him. So this is what Gilbert thinks. She should look at him, that red-haired Shirley girl with the little pointed chin and the big eyes that weren't like the eyes of any other girl in Avonlea School. So Gilbert wants Anne to look at him. Here's what he does. Gilbert reached across the aisle, picked up the end of Anne's long red braid, held it out at arm's length, and said in a piercing whisper, "Carrots! Carrots!" Then Anne looked at him with a vengeance. She did more than look. She sprang to her feet, her bright fancies fallen into cureless ruin. She flashed one indignant glance at Gilbert from eyes whose angry sparkle was swiftly quenched in equally angry tears. "You mean, hateful boy!" she exclaimed passionately. "How dare you!" And then, whack! Anne had brought her slate down on Gilbert's head and cracked it. Slate, not head, clear across. Avonlea School always enjoyed a scene. By the way, the title of this chapter is A Tempest in the School Teapot. Avonlea School always enjoyed a scene. This was an especially enjoyable one. Everybody said, "Oh!" in horrified delight. Diana gasped. Ruby Gillis, who was inclined to be hysterical, began to cry. Tommy Sloane let his team of crickets escape him altogether while he stared open-mouthed at the tableau, at the drama. Mr. Phillips stalked down the aisle and laid his hand heavily on Anne's shoulder. "Anne Shirley, what does this mean?" he said angrily. Anne returned no answer. It was asking too much of flesh and blood to expect her to tell before the whole school that she had been called carrots. Gilbert it was who spoke up stoutly. So Gilbert could have let Anne take the blame, but instead he says, "It was my fault, Mr. Phillips. I teased her." Gilbert is not being a bully. He realizes he hurt Anne's feelings, and he's not going to let her get in trouble for it. Except Mr. Phillips paid no heed to Gilbert. He ignores Gilbert. "I am sorry to see a pupil of mine displaying such a temper and such a vindictive spirit," unforgiving attitude, he said in a solemn tone, as if the mere fact of being a pupil of his ought to root out all evil passions from the hearts of small, imperfect mortals. "Anne, go and stand on the platform in front of the blackboard for the rest of the afternoon." Anne would have infinitely preferred a whipping, and by the way, yes, teachers could spank students at this point in history. Anne would have preferred a whipping to this punishment, to having to stand in front of everybody, under which her sensitive spirit quivered as from a whiplash. With a white, set face, she obeyed. Mr. Phillips took a chalk crayon and wrote on the blackboard above her head. Now, these are the exact words. That's why they're in quotation marks. See if you can notice anything that might make Anne even more upset. He wrote exactly this: "Anne Shirley has a very bad temper. Anne Shirley must learn to control her temper." And Anne has to stand under that sign. He then read it out loud so even the primer class, who couldn't read writing, should understand it. Anne stood there the rest of the afternoon with that legend above her. She did not cry or hang her head. Anger was still too hot in her heart for that, and it sustained her amid all her agony of humiliation. With resentful eyes and passion-red cheeks, she confronted alike Diana's sympathetic gaze and Charlie Sloane's indignant nods and Josie Pye's malicious smiles. Josie Pye is enjoying the fact that Anne is in trouble. As for Gilbert Blythe, she would not even look at him. She would never look at him again. She would never speak to him. When school was dismissed, Anne marched out with her red head held high. Gilbert Blythe tried to intercept her at the porch door. "I'm awful sorry I made fun of your hair, Anne," he whispered contritely. He's truly sorry. That's what contritely means. "Honest I am. Don't be mad for keeps now." Anne swept by disdainfully, without look or sign of hearing. "Oh, how could you, Anne?" breathed Diana as they went down the road, half reproachfully, half admiringly. Diana felt that she could never have resisted Gilbert's plea. "I shall never forgive Gilbert Blythe," said Anne firmly. "And Mr. Phillips spelled my name without an E." Remember when she had to stand up in front of everybody and Mr. Phillips wrote, "Anne Shirley has a bad temper"? He wrote it without the E. "The iron has entered into my soul, Diana." Diana hadn't the least idea what Anne meant, but she understood it was something terrible. "You mustn't mind Gilbert making fun of your hair," she said soothingly. "Why, he makes fun of all the girls. He laughs at mine because it's so black. He's called me a crow 12 times, and I've never heard him apologize for anything either." "There's a great deal of difference between being called a crow and being called carrots," said Anne with dignity. "Gilbert Blythe has hurt my feelings excruciatingly, Diana." It is possible the matter might have blown over without more excruciation if nothing else had happened. But when things begin to happen, they are often apt to keep on. Don't forget your assignment for today. You will need to do it. You will need to go answer the questions. What is a tempest? Where does a tempest usually happen? A really, truly, literal tempest. What would the idiom "a tempest in a teapot" mean? And now, why do you think L.M. Montgomery chose to title this chapter "A Tempest in the School Teapot"? Be sure all of your answers begin with these underlined and bold words. You may not start with other words. You may not answer the question until you have used these underlined and bold words to begin your answer. You might have to change them a little bit, A tempest usually happens. A tempest is. But you must have all of the bold underlined words in your answers, and number 3 should also have quotation marks around it. Be careful. Get this assignment done.